Here we go again. 30th of May 2017. It'll be June shortly, and just amazing how the year's just skipping by, but we're in the middle of winter down here in New Zealand, Wellington. And I thought I'd do a bit of a catch up on a subject that's fairly dear to my heart, the Reformation. And so here we have a Reader's Digest. Oh, sorry. Time and Life version of it. Actually, it's quite well covered. A book with illustrations. Great Ages of the History of the World's Culture, the Reformation, by Edith Simon, and the editors of Time Life Books. Time Life has actually done some interesting stuff. It's not all bad. And very grateful that books like this have been published, because they give you quite a good overview of what was happening. Now, there's Martin Luther. Actually, the interesting thing is today, if you talk to people about Martin Luther, they think you're talking about the black guy who lived in the 60s in America, who led various peace protests and, racial liberation issues. And I think he was, an interesting man, but by no means the same as the Martin Luther from the Reformation. Of course, the American is Martin Luther King, and this is just plain good old Martin Luther, who people really don't know much about. It's extraordinary. They don't know much about the Reformation. And when you talk to people, it's possibly because of our geographical location, but there are Lutherans in New Zealand, Lutheran churches, and of course they'll most likely know about Martin Luther. You can't be certain, of course, and most Lutherans, I very much doubt if they've read as much on Luther as I have, and I'm not really a Lutheran. If I am, and I'm certainly an independent one. I could be thought of easily as an independent Lutheran. But I came across his work when I was a teenager, and the debate between Erasmus and Luther on the bondage of the will was the one thing that really gripped me. I just thought it was just incredibly amazing. I was utterly fascinated in Luther after I read that debate. And of course Erasmus was the Dutch intellectual, really, and there was Luther. Erasmus, a Catholic intellectual. But after Luther had finished the debate, Erasmus was unable to actually condemn Luther for what he had done. In fact, he ended up saying, "Brother Martin, what you're saying is all true, but you mustn't say these things publicly." Now that was, it's interesting that even then there was this fear that ordinary people ought not to be exposed to these kinds of ideas. Anyway, the amazing thing, and I do urge YouTube viewers to do a little research into the life of Martin Luther, primarily because he had a huge impact on our Western culture, which is fast being dissolved in front of our eyes, actually, by humanism and liberalism and any other form of ism you can think of. Luther was certainly a well ensconced Catholic, and he really never wanted to leave. It was unfortunate as far as he was concerned, but he was expelled. Luther had no intention of leaving the Catholic Church. But by a series of events, and of course, he ended up being protected by an interesting aristocrat, in fact one of the princes in Germany at the time, Frederick the Magnanimous, Elector of Saxony. And I can show you a picture of him and Zwingli, Luther's protector. And of course, there he is there, big guy. Of course, he was the ruling force at the time. There's Luther, and over here, Zwingli, the Swiss the Swiss theologian. So Luther, after he'd gone to Rome to make his case in the Vatican, was kidnapped on his way back to Germany, because the prince that supported him was convinced that he would be killed. And I think he was right, actually, because later he says, history will show whether what I did was right. It absolutely was. And so, it is just the most fascinating time. And I'm sure you can get copies of this book on the Reformation, Time Life. In fact, because the illustrations in it are just fabulous, and it catches so much of the spirit of the day, the illustrations that are here. Beautiful woodcuts by Dürer and others, but just absolutely incredible. Look at this. Look at that for a woodcut. Isn't that incredible? That's just absolutely amazing. And if you like, if there was an artist that represented the Reformation, it was Dürer, Albert Dürer. I'll just see if I can find. And of course, the Reformation triggered the Counter-Reformation, and where the Catholic Church fought back against the blow that Luther had struck. It was actually referred to, excuse me, as the Council of Trent, a group of bishops which met from 1545 to 1563. They sought to define, in the light of Luther's proclamations, church dogma. Now, there were unbelievable. The Sons of the Reformation didn't come without the shedding of blood, and the Catholic response was utterly brutal. St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where in virtually one night the French Catholics rose against the Huguenots, the French Protestants. Effectively, they slaughtered them all. So these were, times where you had to really be prepared to die for your ideas. And I guess it's sort of like that again now in some places around the world, where the pressure's coming on religiously and ideologically. That the main thrust of Luther's theological position was to give God back his sovereignty, and that I think and with that sovereignty, solely by Scripture, solely by Christ, solely by grace and solely by faith, cemented Luther's thinking that one was utterly justified by faith plus absolutely nothing. That's how salvation was obtained, through justification by faith in Christ's work plus absolutely nothing. That was it. That was a really powerful restating of the biblical position on the Gospels, the gospel of salvation, that Christ had come and died for the entire world, and that the way to salvation was through total acceptance of his doing and dying, and indeed his resurrection. Right. So I think just for now, because this is just a little, catch up, and I'm certain that Google is eager to have more. In fact, I know they are, to have more of my broadcasts on YouTube, and so we'll wrap this one up here now. There is a tremendous amount of information that you can Google on Martin Luther, the Reformation reformer, and again, not to be confused with the American Martin Luther King, the black. Luther was the 14th century real thing. Possibly no one contended more strongly for the faith than Martin Luther. So if you have theistic inclinations and you haven't acquired any of the insights, or you haven't acquired any insights into what the Reformation was really doing, I urge you to look into it now, because we're living in a time where only three things could happen. Either we have another Reformation, or we have totalitarian governments breaking out everywhere, or we get the return of Christ. So there you are, and in a way, that's what I've just stated is almost like a Schaefferism. I'm sure it is, actually. That's what Francis Schaeffer said, and on that point I would agree with him. Of course, the other thing that I want to emphasize is that Luther also, like Nikolai Tesla, was absolutely committed to the cosmology of a flat earth, zetetic cosmology. Now, you can Google that as well. Okay, we'll leave this for now, and we'll speak to you anon.